Okay. რატო არ იწყება?
თქვენ დაინა.
ხო არ იწყება ჯერ. როდის დაიწყება? Hello, good afternoon. Your Excellency, please let me first address the conference as a host, and then I'll kindly ask you to address. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, I'd like to kindly welcome all participants of the conference and wish you an interesting day. I take this opportunity and on the behalf of the University of Georgia, express my special gratitude to the US Ambassador, Her Excellency Degnan, for the support and participation on the conference, and for the support that the University of Georgia has been receiving from the US since its commencement. I'd like to express my gratitude to the NATO Liaison Office for the support and for the sponsorship of the conference. Let me thank distinguished speakers and participants of the conference. The University of Georgia seeks to become a leading university in the region. We wish to contribute to the development of the human capital, the democratization process, and the development of the society as a whole. Our mission is to make Georgia a regional hub of higher education, to provide a solid educational foundation that prepares students for a diverse, multicultural, and international labor. Recognizing our role as a progressive and leading university within this country, the University of Georgia realized its share of responsibility towards the present and future of Georgia. And for the country, 20% of the territory of which is occupied by Russia, awareness of impending or potential threats from the occupier is of great importance. As the biggest private university in Georgia, with more than 7,000 students across the multiple academic fields, we stand at the forefront of organizing a cross-sectoral debates that have strategic, political, and societal relevance. Today, the University of Georgia hosts its second annual conference within the University of Georgia Security Platform Framework. A conference is titled Georgia in the Western and Russian Military Prism, If or When. Last year, on June 17th, we had launched our first conference within the same platform on the Russian economic influence in the post-socialist countries and the respective political impact, which brought together senior political decision makers and think tank representatives from the US, Europe, and South Caucasus. The topics discussed during the conference were related to the existing mechanisms of Kremlin influence in the region and beyond, and once again were proved relevant, as they were the core factors of the political crisis that unfolded in Georgia since June 20th. This time, we are going to highlight the military aspect of the West Russia confrontation in the context of the South Caucasus and the wider Black Sea region. We are keen to uncover all relevant aspects of the regional military posture, the strategic military intentions and capabilities on the ground, escalatory scenarios, etc., with the ultimate objective to formulate policy recommendations and concepts in the particular fields of military or political activities. The conference will be divided into 3 panels. First panel is NATO-Georgia, membership, military relevance, and Article 5. Second panel is Russia and the South Caucasus, military posture, risks, and escalation or de-escalation options. The third panel is the military aspects of the Black Sea security. We're proud that along with the conference, a parallel simulation exercise will be conducted with the participation of 30 students from different Georgian universities. This will allow students to grasp the real policy atmosphere and the gravity of political decision-making at various levels during the crisis and conflicts. By the way, simulation exercise of this kind is introduced first time in Georgia, and it adds special fascination to today's event. Once again, let me thank all participants of this conference. I wish you a successful day, and probably what doesn't sound trivial nowadays, I wish you a good health. And we hope that next year we'll have opportunity to meet you here in Georgia. Thank you very much. I'm done. Your Excellency, yours the floor. I kindly ask you to address the conference.
Thank you very much, Rector Topuria. It's a real pleasure to open this conference today, and I commend the University of Georgia and the NATO Liaison Office for organizing this event and for assembling such a distinguished panel of participants and speakers. Hats off as well to the students and academics who were able to adapt to today's unusual circumstances and tune in virtually. We're all getting better at that, at least more used to it. The topic of Georgia's role in the Black Sea region and its relationships with Russia and NATO is particularly timely. The unresolved legacy of the Soviet Union's collapse has flared again into renewed conflict on Georgia's southern borders, a tragic reminder of the geopolitical significance and the delicate balance of the Caucasus region. The stabilizing role that Georgia has so often played over the centuries is once again being tested by the competing interests of its neighbors. Since arriving in Georgia 8 months ago, I've been very impressed by Georgia's tenacity in preserving its unique character and traditions, despite waves of foreigners who have passed through. Georgia's language, religion, culture, and fierce love of freedom have withstood intense pressures. The more I learn about Georgia's fight for independence, the more admiration I have for this country. Where Georgia is located and who its neighbors are is not going to change. That means Georgia will continue to face challenges that test its ability to be a stabilizing influence and democratic leader in the region. Since at least 2008, we've seen Russia become increasingly aggressive in trying to undermine its Black Sea neighbors. For decades, Russia has tried to prevent this region from achieving its full potential by sowing instability in Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, through illegal occupations, violent conflicts, economic and political disruptions, including through corruption, transnational criminal networks, and disinformation, as Professor Galliotti has documented so well. The vision that Georgia, the United States, and Europe have of a stable region of sovereign states engaged in mutually beneficial trade and security relationships requires our constant and vigilant collective commitment. It is imperative that we continue with initiatives that deter Russian aggression and malign influence in Georgia and the Black Sea region as a whole. This includes continuing to promote closer security cooperation among countries around the Black Sea through NATO and bilaterally. It includes developing closer economic ties, battling corruption and organized crime networks, securing critical infrastructure, and pursuing reforms that are so essential to Georgia's democratic progress and its Euro-Atlantic trajectory. Russian aggression toward Georgia in particular, occupation, borderization, economic blackmail, cyber attacks, demonstrate Russia's intent to erode Georgia's security, stability, and economic prosperity, no matter how friendly or conciliatory Georgia tries to be. Russia's insidious disinformation campaigns, from disparaging Georgia's progress toward NATO membership and participation in multinational exercises, to targeting the life-saving work of the Lugar Center and Georgia's NCDC, leave no doubt that Russia hopes to break down the civic and defense institutions that are Georgia's bulwarks against Russia's malign influence and vital to Georgia's future with the West. Russia's tactics hinder diplomatic resolution of conflicts in the region. We've all seen that. Improved security, resilience, and strong democratic institutions in Georgia and its neighbors will deny Russia the opportunities that it's so good at exploiting to disrupt stability and progress. Our unity with Georgia and Georgia's commitment to building strong, independent institutions and a vibrant economy are the best deterrents to Russian aggression and the best assurance of regional stability. Georgia's robust partnership with NATO is arguably the best example of a key partner nation committed to making concrete contributions to NATO's broader deterrence and defense posture in the Black Sea region and beyond. We all know that Georgia's role in ISAF and the Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan are as the largest per capita troop contributor, serving with no caveats, is an impressive commitment that has cost Georgia 32 lives and almost 300 wounded, and one for which NATO and the United States are truly grateful. Georgia has also stepped up to successfully host NATO and multinational exercises such as Noble Partner, despite the challenges of COVID-19. Georgia's commitment to NATO through these and other initiatives, such as the substantial NATO-Georgia package, demonstrate clearly how far the Georgian Defense Forces have come in raising standards and increasing Georgia's interoperability with NATO. Every step Georgia takes to strengthen its capabilities to defend its borders, expand its economies, and develop its democratic institutions is a step toward protecting the independence Georgians have fought so passionately for over the centuries. To paraphrase George Washington, to be prepared for conflict is the most effectual means to promote peace. I encourage Georgia to remain clear-eyed about the threats to its stability and progress, to prepare by building strategic capabilities, and to be courageous in playing a leadership role in the region. I hope you'll enjoy your discussions today, and thank you very much for letting me join you. Madoba.
I have the pleasure of chairing this first panel entitled NATO-Georgia Military Relevance, Membership and the Future of Article 5. As has been mentioned, Georgia has obviously been a country that has been pursuing closer relationships and ties with NATO for over 20, 30 years now. And there are a lot of exciting panelists with me today to discuss some of the future prospects for that deepening relationship. Of course, following on from the remarks of the ambassador and with gratitude for the university for their support in organising. just a few quick comments on the kind of ground rules for today. Obviously, we're quite interested to make sure that we get to a lot of questions and are able to have a really kind of interactive discussion with the various attendees on the line today. So we'll have some opening remarks from myself and the other panelists, each of whom will have 10 minutes to deliver their initial thoughts on this topic. And then we'll open it up to a Q&A, and all of you are very much encouraged to provide questions as we're going using the tools available on Zoom. And then I will try and bring those in later on into the discussion to try and make sure that this is as dynamic and interactive as can be within the limitations, of course, of COVID social distancing. So to quickly introduce myself, my name is James Black. I'm one of the research leaders in the defense program at RAND Europe, which is the European arm of the US-based RAND Corporation, a not-for-profit research institute that does a lot of work for the US and European governments, helping them think through some of their strategic and policy challenges. Incidentally, one of my US colleagues from RAND, Steve Flanagan, will be speaking in a later panel on Black Sea security, so there's enough of us to go around. At RAND, I lead a lot of studies for UK and European ministries of defense, as well as for European agencies and NATO, helping them think through future issues around defense strategy, posture, and doctrine, and also organize war games and simulations looking at threats to the alliance. And it's great to see that a simulation exercise is running in parallel to this. And as has been mentioned already by the host, this is one of the first such exercises in Georgia. So it's really interesting to see that kind of capability being brought to the university. So in opening this panel, I thought I'd just set the scene around three key themes. So the first is the kind of the status of Georgia's steps towards NATO membership. The second is around kind of strategic challenges to the alliance, which of course has its own kind of broader challenges, regardless of Georgia and of the region. And then looking at kind of questions for the future for both sides, for NATO and for Georgia. So starting briefly with the Georgian side of things. As has been mentioned already, Georgia has been making a significant and in many ways outsized contribution to the alliance in recent years. And it's been indeed developing closer ties with NATO since its modern independence. First with the NATO Atlantic Cooperation Council, later through the Euro-Atlantic Cooperation Council, and of course through the Partnership for Peace, which it joined in 1994. Now, it seemed like 2008 would be a turning point in many ways, obviously both in terms of the Russia-Georgia crisis that unfortunately broke out and the conflict that led to, but also the NATO Bucharest summit, which provided an opportunity for NATO's allies, obviously not quite as many of them then as there are today, to agree that Georgia would become a NATO member in future once it had met all of the necessary requirements. And something, a commitment that was reaffirmed at subsequent summits since. Now, Georgia has been heavily investing in its defense modernization, as well as in its broader security sector reform and institution building within the country. Partly, of course, to meet its own national defense requirements and its own government kind of priorities, but also as part of its efforts to try and align itself more closely with NATO and reach those accession requirements. Now, this has included ongoing political dialogue through the NATO-Georgia Commission. It's included lots of practical support on both sides through the substantial NATO-Georgia package, which was announced at the Wales Summit back in 2014. And there's been lots of initiatives around joint training, logistics, education, institution building, strategic and operational planning, interoperability, and many more areas beside. And as the ambassador has also mentioned, Georgia has also been a major contributor to operations alongside NATO allies, showing that it's willing to invest kind of treasure and blood in supporting its friends and partners around Europe and around the North American region, including operations in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Mediterranean, and of course its work hosting recent regional exercises and providing kind of unique Georgian insight into Russian thinking and operations in that region. And also, of course, the broader region and other neighbors. Now, at the same time, a decade on from Bucharest, Georgia is, of course, still not yet a NATO ally. And certainly this does not seem to be a kind of lack of enthusiasm or popular support on the Georgian side. So even as within NATO, there has been kind of varying levels of enthusiasm within the public for NATO membership across different nations, and varying levels of understanding of the benefits and purpose and mission of the alliance. Georgians have kind of shown consistently high levels of support, including growing support, notably amongst those ethnic minorities within the Georgian population who have traditionally been slightly more skeptical of Georgians' plans to join the alliance. Now, our panel will interrogate why that disconnect is between some of the ambitions of 10, 12 years ago, and kind of the situation we have now, and also try and think about what levers Georgia might have to try and influence NATO, both when it's outside of the alliance, but also potentially in future when it's inside the alliance, how it can, as a small nation, influence that large group of large nations, and how it can kind of encourage NATO in a direction that obviously is favorable to Georgia's own priorities. Now, my second theme that I'll briefly speak about is of course, some of the major challenges that NATO faces more broadly. Now, these are important both because they, of course, are what Georgia is letting itself in for if and when it becomes part of the NATO alliance, but they also provide the political and strategic backdrop that conditions discussions around Georgia's own accession, and also conditions the sorts of capabilities, commitments, and so on that Georgia would be asked to make as an ally. Now, first of all, it's worth mentioning some of the kind of broad strategic and military challenges. And as the ambassador has ably explained, we've seen a real change in the strategic environment in recent years. We've seen a return to great power competition, or at least a return to an awareness and a prioritization of that great power competition amongst NATO, because there are many, of course, that would argue that for Russia and for others, that never really went away. We've got new threats, both above and below the threshold of open conflict, ongoing challenges from Russian military modernization and its conventional and nuclear capabilities, but also lots of activities in what is often called in the US and UK, the grey zone. So those sort of kind of deniable, non-attributable operations just below the threshold of open conflict. And we've seen certainly Ukraine, Syria, and of course, unfortunately, Georgia and other countries in the Caucasus providing a test bed for those kind of new tactics and capabilities. We've seen a return on the NATO side then to rebuilding kind of forces, strategies and plans for high-end conflict and for deterring peer adversaries, and building more resilience, deployability and readiness, all of which introduce new challenges, of course, in a large multinational alliance. We've also seen a kind of growing membership, obviously with countries like Montenegro, Macedonia moving into the NATO orbit, and also a kind of broadening geographic remit. So thinking not just about threats from Russia and others in the north, the east and the south, but also increasingly looking further afield, looking to the high north, for example, kind of reorienting again to the Atlantic sea lines of communication, thinking about Africa and what different countries and proxy groups are doing there, and also increasingly thinking about the influence of China, a growing issue of particular concern to the US, but also one that a lot of European nations are increasingly thinking about. And of course, the London Declaration in December of last year began speaking about China as an issue for the alliance and for kind of really for the first time. We've also seen NATO embracing new domains such as cyber and space. We've also seen it thinking a lot about technology and innovation. And so the NATO alliance that Georgia is kind of trying to develop its ties with is an alliance that is itself adapting, innovating and changing. And this presents a number of opportunities, but also a number of challenges for a nation such as Georgia. Now, on the political side, we've obviously got a lot of transatlantic tensions at the moment, as I'm sure you would have noticed. There have been some added pressure on NATO and pressures around burden sharing and making sure there is an equitable division of kind of contributions and commitments from different nation states. We've seen the impact of Brexit. We've seen a new relationship between the EU and NATO, renewed tensions amongst NATO allies in the Eastern Mediterranean and around Syria as well. Concerns around kind of populism and the erosion of democratic values. So we see an alliance that's celebrating more than 70 years of working together, but clearly is also facing the complexities of adapting to a 21st century political and strategic environment. And finally, it's worth mentioning some of the economic challenges that NATO is under. Now, of course, defense spending and difficulties in securing budget amongst other priorities such as health and education is certainly nothing new. And the growing costs of defense technology is, again, a trend that we've seen for decades now. But of course, in recent years, there's added pressure on all of this because of the strategic and military challenges I mentioned, but also some of the political pressures. And all of this, of course, been made more complicated recently for the economic impact of the COVID pandemic, which is clearly going to have a kind of short, medium and long-term effect, some of which is only just beginning to become clear. So all of this raises important questions for the future of kind of NATO-Georgia relations. And I will turn over now to some of our panelists who will start to tease out some of the answers and dilemmas associated with those questions in a bit more detail. But just so I can kind of begin to frame things in people's mind, it strikes me that the first real key question we face is how to engage and deter Russia, including the Black Sea region, without unwanted escalation or undermining the credibility of Article 5, which is clearly a concern for some nations within NATO when they start thinking about broadening membership. How can we maximize the influence of small nations such as Georgia with and through NATO? And we'll be hearing some insights from countries such as Lithuania later in this panel, which might guide how Georgia can go about kind of using its finite political capital and military capabilities in a way that is going to get it the most influence and kind of bang for its buck within NATO. And finally, how can we think about overcoming some of the enduring practical and political barriers to closer relations with NATO, and of course to membership and making that membership success if and when it comes about. So lots of ground to cover, I'm sure you'll agree. We have obviously an interesting morning or afternoon ahead of us. So I'll just be turning over now to our panelists to hear some of their perspectives. Our first speaker is going to be Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges, who's currently the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at SEPA in Washington, and formerly, and I'm sure known to many of you, as Commander of US Army Forces in Europe up until 2017. So he'll be speaking on the theme of great power competition prevents great power conflict. And with that, I turn it over now to Ben for his opening remarks of 10 minutes.
Thanks, James. So first of all, Georgia should be in NATO already. I mean, I'd like to say I don't know what we're waiting for, but of course I do know why it hasn't happened yet. But Georgia has nothing else to prove in terms of its contributions and its willingness to do what it takes. But there are a few things that still need to be done to accelerate this process. But let me be very clear, Georgia should be in NATO already. The Kremlin should not get a vote. And I think that we can discuss what needs to be done. The biggest problem is that nobody or very few people in Washington, D.C. or in Brussels truly appreciate the strategic importance of the Caucasus and of the Black Sea region, why it matters so much to the United States and to Western Europe, why this is important. And so that's why I think we've got some work to do to elevate the strategic importance. And I'm going to offer a couple of suggestions. Now, of course, the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh here over the past 2 weeks has reminded the world why the Caucasus matters so much strategically. It is the east-west portal for oil, gas, telecom, and trade if we want to avoid having to go through Russia or Iran. The fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh has also reminded us of the lethality of a modern battlefield, the threat to civilians, and also our vulnerability to drones. I'm sure many of you have been watching the drone strikes by Azeri forces hitting tanks and vehicles and troops sitting around in the open, and it's a real vulnerability that Georgian armed forces need to be paying attention to. I will say that I'm pleased that military cooperation between the United States, NATO, and Georgia continues to improve each year in terms of scope, scale, and sophistication from the first time I went to Georgia for a Noble Partner exercise to what was just recently completed. And also the U.S. Army National Guard State Partnership Program, where the state of Georgia is partnered with the Republic of Georgia, is one of the best. And it ensures that there is a near continuous U.S. military presence in Georgia. But my recommendations, I'm breaking them down into the familiar DIME construct, D-I-M-E, diplomacy, information, military, and economy. As James said, the title of my little bit here is Great Power Competition Prevents Great Power Conflict. And by this, I mean, if we are competing in the diplomatic space, the information space, and the economic space, as well as in the military space, then the chances of a miscalculation by the Kremlin, for example, that we don't care or we're not interested, I think the chances of that miscalculation go down. So the more that we can compete in all of these spaces consistently, it actually helps prevent an actual conflict from breaking out. Now, in terms of diplomacy, number one, Georgia has got to put its voice together with other Black Sea nations in Washington and in Brussels. So with Ukraine, Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria, the way that the Baltic countries did after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all three got very loud and very active in Washington. And I could guarantee you that today, almost every member of Congress could correctly identify Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on a map. I doubt that's the case when it comes to Black Sea nations. So you've got to put your voices together in Washington and in Brussels, and also use international bodies to continue to highlight Russia's occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Also, your diplomatic effort has got to be focused on getting NATO to raise the priority of the Black Sea region. I'm starting to feel this a little bit, but it's not enough. The second part of this framework of DIME is the information space. And here, you've got to convince people in the West, as well as your own population, of that you do indeed support liberal democracy. This means transparency of government, transparency of legal and judicial processes, and transparency of elections. You can see very clearly how actively the Kremlin is working to cause Americans to lose confidence in our electoral process. So you can imagine then what they're doing right there in Georgia. Also, protecting of human rights, journalistic freedoms. These are all parts of competition in the information space. And finally, it goes to societal resilience. Do Georgians trust their government? Do Georgians trust the electoral process? Do Georgians trust the judicial process? If you don't, then you become much more vulnerable to Kremlin disinformation efforts and malign activity and corruption. And these are just as dangerous, maybe even more so, than Iskander missiles raining down on Vaziani or Tbilisi. The third part of the framework, military. I would say Georgia should act as if it's in NATO already. Certainly American soldiers look at Georgian soldiers as if you are already in NATO. Of course, there's not the Article 5 commitment, but in terms of standards, procedures, modernization efforts, going to military schools, exchange programs, this should be done as if you were already in NATO, and make the preparations on the ground as well. Modernization, this is not just about putting money on programs. The concept of defense, how Georgia plans to defend itself, is what should drive the modernization efforts and what programs you want to purchase. And for smaller countries that don't have huge population or huge budget, you've obviously got to be super careful here. For the Georgian Coast Guard, I would specifically recommend investing in maritime unmanned systems. These are excellent for anti-submarine, anti-mines, and they're very efficient, cost-effective. They don't require crews and a lot of infrastructure. Also, improve the collaboration with Ukrainian naval forces and Romanian naval forces. I would also recommend consideration of temporary naval facilities for the United States Navy and other allies when they come to visit, to do port visits. What can you do to increase infrastructure there? And in the same vein, I would like to see the United States Air Force establish a temporary facility there at one of the two major airfields near Tbilisi, similar to what we have at MK in Romania or Powitz in Poland, where we're accustomed to flying in and out, making it more attractive. And then finally, I'd like to see the Black Sea exercises combined into a major regional exercise, similar to what the Kremlin just did with the Caucuses 2020. So you get Noble Partner from Georgia, Saber Guardian from Romania, and Sea Breeze, which is the Ukrainian-hosted naval exercise. Time these and bring them together to really exercise regional command and control and cooperation, and then find out how fast can we get there? How fast can allies and friends get to Georgia in time of a crisis when surely that movement will be contested? The last piece here, in terms of recommendations within the DIME construct, of course, is economy. And this to me is much more important than modernizing armed forces, because if you can make Georgia attractive to private investment from Western European countries and the United States, then Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, France will pay a lot more attention to what Russia is doing there. Georgia clearly should be the portal between Eurasia and Europe. But honestly, I have been disappointed that the Anaklia port project has been stopped by the government. Recent efforts to improve telecom communications, pipes from Eurasia through Georgia into Europe have been stopped by the parliament. So to me, this is a direct reflection of Kremlin disinformation, Kremlin corruption, Kremlin pressure. And this is why I've emphasized the importance of a strong, resilient society to be able to block that interference from the Kremlin. The economic minister of Georgia challenged me on this a few months ago, said that Anaklia was in fact a priority for the government of Georgia. And I absolutely don't believe that. If it was, it would already be well underway. The last thing that the Kremlin wants is to see Georgia being prosperous and to see European countries invested there. And that's why they're going to do everything they can to stop it. And I will stop there and look forward to questions or challenges.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I can already see some questions coming in the Q&A function on Zoom, which is great. And we'll certainly pick those up later on once the rest of the panelists have had a chance to make their opening remarks. So that being said, our next panelist is going to be Zygimantas Pavlionis, a member of the Lithuanian Parliament who has been extensively involved with his country's European and foreign affairs, and specifically also with the relationship with NATO. So he'll be speaking on the theme of Georgia's membership with NATO, advice from Vilnius. And so with that, I turn over the floor.
Okay, I hope you hear me well. I would agree with every word General was saying, maybe just to add something from Baltic experience or Lithuanian experience. I was at NATO Bucharest summit where we've been lobbying membership action plans for Georgia and Ukraine. And I still regard the Bucharest NATO decisions as failure, as a failure of the West to project strategic vision for Europe sees to make this Europe whole and free. In a way, President Reagan and some other great visionaries did it for the Baltics. The weakness that we produced in Bucharest was a green light for Russia to occupy Georgia and Ukraine. Those countries paid a heavy price for our inability to think strategically about the region, to project the security. And I think this is something we as a West have to do for Georgia, to pay our debts, because it was wrong. I still remember sitting in NATO Chicago summit behind the Hillary Clinton. I still remember her saying that the next NATO summit will be something where we will produce map for Georgia. It didn't happen, and it continues like this. So looking to our mistakes and learning for it, we have to do it as a West. And even looking to what is happening right now in Armenia and Azerbaijan, and looking to the decisions those countries made in 2013 during Lithuanian EU presidency, when Russia pressed them to withdraw from association agreements. I think that was also another mistake. So conclusion from Baltic experience, the sooner you get the clear promise of NATO and EU membership, the better. This is the only thing that can deter Russia from further actions. We got it quite early in our history. In '93, in Copenhagen European Council, we got the green light, more or less, for EU, signaling that after free trade and association agreements, we will be members of the European Union. And, believe it or not, that was psychologically the year where Russia started to respect us, when they withdraw the troops, because it is not Russia that draw the line. This is us that draws the line. And unfortunately, we didn't do it, and we are not doing it for more than a decade. So this is what I have to confess from the West side. Well, of course, from Georgia's side, I would completely agree with everything General and previous speakers said. You just have to be ready, and not only ready, you have to be excellent. You cannot be average. You have to be excellent on all fronts, be it military reform, be it economic reforms, be it your democratic credentials, be it your elections that are coming so quickly. As NATO Secretary General recently said in his statement, you have to get the highest international standards, in your elections. You just have to be perfect. If you wanna be in the screens of computers of the West, you have to be exceptional. Like, for some time, Estonia was exceptional in the Baltics, and they got that prize, one of the first. Then we learned from that mistake, and we understood that we as Lithuanians, or as the Baltics, we have to be the best. So being the best is one thing. To show it and to lobby the West is another thing. To be honest, when I was ambassador in Washington, D.C., I was admired by your lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. What it means, and also learning from Baltic example, it means a lot of money, to be honest, a lot of money that you have to allocate to this campaign. And if you see that official Washington or official Berlin or London or any other countries, they do not take into consideration, lobby not only the government, work with all possible think tanks, make contracts with them, let them write studies about you, work with universities, work with business communities, work with every congressman, go to every state, every state where they were elected, speak with their audiences. It means a lot of efforts and a lot of money. But you can do it. Work with journalists, work with the wisest brains you have in the West, work with conscience that with people with a heart in every society that you have. So make a plan to build a coalition of willing that would support your membership in NATO. It's huge work. Take the people like Ben Hodges and others, former prime ministers, presidents, who would advise your government weekly, every month, because they know the temperatures in their own countries. They know how to lobby the government. Work on party levels. I'm Christian Democrat. Okay, do it with Christian Democrats. But you see that Greens are rising in Germany. Do it with Greens. Work with Social Democrats. Work with liberals. So to make it short, well, nobody will do it for you. You have to build those coalitions using, devoted friends like us in the West. But I don't feel, to be honest, kind of leadership in this area from Georgia. When I look to your ambassadors in different countries, I don't feel that they are really caring about that. In most of the cases, those are Lithuanian or some other ambassadors who are more Georgian ambassadors than your own. But you have to have the best people, maybe even educated in those countries where you try to lobby, and drive it, finance it, lobby it on all the levels. And I think it's doable. If you will behave honestly in your country, and you will be the champion on different reforms in your country, if you will really put hard work on those lobbying efforts, in 2-3 years, well, at least in Lithuania, we have a plan to Lithuanian EU presidency in 27. We will make you member of EU, that's EU side. But let's do it also on NATO side. We are ready, but we need your leadership, devoted people, your money. We can also raise money all around, and we have to do it. EU and NATO is now turning to Balkans with a slogan that we have to kick Chinese and Russians out. Well, the same slogans could be applied to Europe's East. Look what they do with those regions. That's occupations, killings. Well, I didn't even mention Belarus, what is happening there. If the West is not spreading its strategic vision to those regions, if we just leave them in a gray zone, be sure Russians will grab it. So if we didn't learn from those mistakes, look to the Baltic example. We are example of NATO strategic and EU visions. We are happy, thriving, and trying to spread this stability all around. but don't do it like in Bucharest in 2008. That was the worst strategic mistake I ever saw. And for the last 12 or 13 years, you know, democracy is retreating in Europe's east. And that's also responsibility of the West, not only of Georgians. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and certainly a lot for us to pick up in the Q&A later. So moving on, conscious of the time, and again, please keep the Q&A questions coming in on Zoom. Our next panelist is going to be Dr. Ian Anthony, who's Director of the European Security Programme at CIPRI. So he'll be speaking on the theme of how partnership with NATO might facilitate cooperation on threats to critical infrastructure, including those posed by the use of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear materials. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ian for your remarks.
Okay, well, thank you, James, and thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to speak with you. I hope you can hear me. I want to frame my remarks basically with two observations. The first is around the parameters of what we mean by national defence. NATO has introduced resilience guidelines, which it described as a core element of collective defence, which is really an illustration that when we think about national defence, we're talking about more than the protection of borders against armed attack. We have the attention that's paid now to so-called hybrid scenarios, conditions of neither war nor peace. And we still have the issue of counterterrorism, which is an unresolved security problem for many states. A second observation is that in the summer, NATO decided to update these resilience guidelines. And it did so because of the new conversation which was started by the COVID-19 pandemic around what is an acceptable level of risk. Accepting that it's not possible to avoid all types of risk, and that a balance has to be struck between various different types of economic activity and necessary security measures. And what do the authorities, but also what do the public consider to be acceptable levels of risk? So I think these two questions of what are the parameters of national defense and what are acceptable levels of risk are very live parts of the current debate on defense. And I'd like to just focus on one aspect, which is the risks posed by various types of hazardous materials. I think it's justifiable now to think about preparing a tailored response, because we have enough cases of the use of hazardous materials in attacks on politically exposed persons. We can go back to 2004, the poisoning of Mr. Yushchenko in the context of the color revolution brewing in Ukraine, and say that perhaps already then we should have paid much more attention to this question than we did. But since then, we've had the killing of Mr. Litvinenko using radioactive material, the attempted killing of Mr. Skripal using a chemical substance, and the still unexplained, though I think we're coming close to an explanation of what happened to Mr. Navalny. So we have an accumulation of cases which probably justifies a broader and more systematic response to various different aspects of the problem. That would include the issue of cleanup and recovery. I think the example of the attack in the United Kingdom in Salisbury is illustrative. It took almost a year to return to public use parts of a small rural city which had been exposed to milligram quantities of a very dangerous substance. If an attack like that had occurred in a major financial center or a major port, the consequences would have been much greater. The costs were very high in the UK, and we also learned that some of the response mechanisms, particularly the support which was provided by the military, was not really tailored to the contingency. The military units were trained to solve a different problem from the one that confronted them in Salisbury. There's a second dimension to that, which is the question of investigation and attribution. The attacks are also crime scenes. If you think about the attack on Mr. Litvinenko, essentially one of the larger and more populated boroughs of the City of London became an enormous crime scene for forensic investigation and follow-up law enforcement efforts. So we still have to think through how to deal with some of the specific dimensions of that, the recovery and analysis of items of evidence which are also contaminated with a dangerous substance, the management of evidence that has to be presented in a criminal case. These are all issues which deserve close attention. And finally, the nature of the response. If you can, to your own satisfaction and the satisfaction of others, attribute an attack to an external source, what are you going to do about it? And that has both a political dimension, but also a legal response in the form of international arrest warrants that you might want to issue, the question of what types of targeted sanctions might be effective and under what circumstances they would be implemented. So whether you're looking at cleanup and recovery or investigation and attribution or response, I would say there's a strong case for looking at a systematic approach to the use of hazardous materials as a risk to national defense. If we look at that in the context of NATO, as I mentioned before, the resilience guidelines already exist and they're going to be updated based on the decision in the summer. So Georgia should certainly both be aware of that and play a full role in discussing how to implement existing guidelines and how they should be modified. But I think it's possible to do more than that. The concept of total defense, which Georgia has been working with for 2 or 3 years now, would be a very good platform for discussions both with allies, such as the Netherlands or the United Kingdom, which have a similar approach, or with partners such as Sweden, so-called enhanced opportunity partners of NATO, which again has its own strong focus on a total defense concept. So there's a lot of scope there for discussion in smaller groups. There's a lot of need, I think, now for systematic analysis of events in order to look for lessons learned and good practice around the role of forensic science, around investigation techniques. And I think a strong start there has been made in the area of radioactive materials, including in the Black Sea area, where a lot of countries now have national response plans, but those national response plans still have to be exercised and they have to be connected in a regional response. But in the other areas, particularly chemical substances, there's a need for more systematic analysis of the type that's already been done for radioactive materials. And in the area of potential use of, or deliberate use of disease, I think COVID-19 has really brought home the vulnerability of societies to various different types of infectious disease. And that's probably something which has also come to the attention of malign actors, as well as public health authorities. In terms of multilateral responses, there are frameworks which have been created where Georgia is not yet a member. We could draw attention, for example, to the so-called No Impunity Partnership, which was created by France in the beginning of 2018 in response to chemical attacks. So that's one example of a more politically orientated, informal network rather than an international organization. But still, I think it would be useful for Georgia to take a look at what there is already out there in terms of international networks that it might be useful to become a member of and participate in the discussions. So in conclusion, I wanted to put this on the table as an area where I think Georgia has significant resources to bring to the table. As I think the ambassador mentioned in her opening remarks, there are facilities which have been created in Georgia that can play a role in thinking through some of these problems, not least in the biofield. And Georgia is also an important partner of the European Union in thinking about the response to chemical, biological, radiological risk management. So thank you again for the opportunity, and I'm happy to take this in any direction you would like to in the Q&A.
Many thanks. A very interesting view on a particularly growing challenge for Georgia, but clearly also for countries around the world. And as you say, one that's taken on new salience, unfortunately, recently with events involving the Russian opposition leader. Now, our final panelist for this afternoon is going to be Dr. Emmanuel Dreyfus, who certainly last but not least. And I'm going to turn over the floor to them now to offer their perspective and remarks before we come back for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much, James, and thank you to the University of Georgia for inviting me. My presentation will be devoted to how France supports Georgia's rapprochement with both NATO and the European Union through an enhanced political and practical defense relation. So let me first emphasize that Georgia is one of the few former one of the few countries in the region, maybe the only one, with which France has such a comprehensive partnership encompassing a very wide range of different sectors, stretching from politics to trade, tourism, education, of course, defense and security. An important milestone was recently reached in this warm, friendly, and comprehensive partnership by the establishment, roughly a year ago, of the Dimitri Amilcavari Dialogue, named after a French officer of Georgian origin, who, as a lieutenant colonel of the French Foreign Legion during the World War II, played a chief role in the French resistance against the Nazi occupation. So far, Georgia is the only country in the area with which France has institutionalized such a high-level dialogue. France's well-established defense partnership with Tbilisi plays a crucial role in this bilateral relation. The defense partnership was launched after a bilateral agreement was signed during the late 90s and reached a first major step with the funding of the Sachkere Mountain Training School in 2006 with a strong French support that has been remarkably consistent since then. On the one hand, starting from 2006, many French officers came to Sachkere to share their experience with their Georgian partners, while every year Georgian mountain instructors are invited to France at the High Mountain Training School to develop their skills and knowledge of mountain warfare. In 2010, after the training school was qualified as a partnership for peace training and education center, many servicemen from various NATO countries started undergo training there. Mountain warfare and cooperation between the two armies were the backbone of the bilateral cooperation with Tbilisi until it reached a new level starting from the mid-2010s, when France started providing a crucial support to Tbilisi in the development of its air defense capacities, after an agreement was signed in 2015. Not only France started providing Georgia with air defense system, but, and this is of utmost importance, France accepted to take the lead of the air defense component of the NATO-Georgia substantial package, which was offered to Georgia following the Wales NATO summit in 2014. And starting from 2016, France has been sending experts, so mostly officers from the French Air Forces, to contribute to the improvement of Georgia air defense capacities. And taking the lead of the air defense component of the SNGP was not only a core milestone in the development of the bilateral defense relation, but also a way to express Paris' strong support to Georgia efforts to move closer to NATO standards by enhancing practical cooperation. Talking about how France is supporting concrete cooperation between NATO and Georgia, I can also evoke, for instance, the various pole calls by French Navy ships in Batumi, which are both a way to demonstrate French support to the free navigation in the Black Sea, and also to conduct various exercises with Georgian partners aimed at developing interoperability. The other crucial dimension of the French bilateral defense relationship with a strong multilateral accent, if I may, is of course Georgia participation in EU's peacekeeping mission in Africa, and more particularly in the Central African Republic. So just a few words about how this pillar of the French-Georgian defense partnership came to fruition. Georgia's contribution to the 3 successive European missions in the Central African Republic started in 2014 after Tbilisi agreed to send one light infantry company-sized unit, which is about 150 servicemen, which was after replaced by a 2 platoon-sized unit, about 85 servicemen, in December 2014. In March 2015, following the launching of a military advisory mission called UMAM-RCA in the Central African Republic, so the goal of this mission was to support the authorities of the Central African Republic in carrying out reforms in the armed forces. Tbilisi agreed to participate by sending 5 servicemen for the whole mission. In the summer 2016, the European Union launched a new training mission in the Central African Republic called European Union Training Mission, in which Georgia has been one of the top contributing nations by sending from the very beginning a platoon-sized unit, so about 35 people, deployed on a 6-month rotation basis. So to my knowledge, already 5 different platoons have already been deployed to the Republic of Central Africa within the framework of this 3rd EU mission. Georgia's contribution to European Union peacekeeping mission in the Republic of Central Africa is of paramount importance for several reasons. First, of course, Georgia's contingent main task, which is securing the areas of deployment of the mission, and mainly Bangui, Central African Republic main city, so Bangui airports, has been from the very beginning highly appreciated both by other contributing nations, and first and foremost France, which is the first contributing nation, but also by the local population. Second, these deployments, together with other contributions to peacekeeping mission in Iraq, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, have been providing crucial operational experience to Georgian armed forces, which is paramount to the further strengthening of Georgia's defense capacities. Last but not least, by providing such a crucial support to European Union's peacekeeping mission in Africa, I remind here that if I'm correct, on the average, Georgia, which is not a EU member, has from the very beginning, so from 2014, been the 2nd most important contributing nation, so after France. So by contributing to this mission, Tbilisi gives strong and concrete demonstrations of its commitment not only to be a security consumer, if I may, but also to be a security provider and a reliable partner in areas which are very remote from the Georgian territory and which constitute top priorities for the EU's diplomatic and security agenda. And these contributions are remarkable. Just a few words to conclude. I would say that speaking about defense ties between France and Georgia, it progressively shifted from a simple but robust military cooperation in the mid-2000s to a comprehensive partnership today, which is mutually beneficial both for Paris and Tbilisi, and which takes place both in the bilateral framework, but also in the multilateral one, which is within NATO and within the EU. While France is contributing to the development of Georgia's defense capacities, both by assisting the strengthening of its land defense and air defense capabilities, Georgia has been providing crucial support to France in the African theater, thus enhancing the interoperability of its armed forces and clearly demonstrating its role as a global security provider. So this was my these were my main points. Thank you very much, and Didi Madloba to all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. If I can just ask all of the panelists to turn their cameras on. You can stay muted until you want to join in, but it'll make it much easier during the Q&A for me to pick up on those who are twitching to answer. Now, we've had a few questions already in the Q&A function. Obviously, all of the audience, I'd encourage you to keep adding some more in response to what you've just heard. And I will also invoke my privilege as moderator to add in a few questions of myself. So I'm going to start us off with a couple of points. Now, picking up on the previous panelists' remarks, I noted that Lieutenant General Hodge spoke a lot about the need to look across the DIME framework and think about the kind of full spectrum of military and non-military capabilities and contributions that Georgia can make, and how important that is to both to Georgia, but also to NATO. Zigmanta spoke a lot about the need for Georgia to be excellent, to be exceptional, and not to be average, and to show leadership and make itself indispensable in the way that other small nations have sought to do. And we've also been hearing about specific capabilities from Dr. Anthony around CBRN, or some of the kind of broader contributions that Emmanuel has just been talking about. So all of that being the case, I'd be interested to hear people's perspectives on what they see as those areas where Georgia can show leadership and where it brings real added value to NATO, and therefore where it's going to have the most influence within the alliance. But first of all, I'm just going to turn it over to General Hodges. There's a question in the Q&A about some of the specific developments, infrastructure in the region. So considering this is a question from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs representative. Considering the recent developments in the Caucasus, Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea, it is important to pay attention to the Istanbul Canal project. If the government of Turkey successfully completes its construction, what might be the implications for the Black Sea region and for the presence and policy of NATO in the area? So first of all, I'll turn over to Ben, and then if you can address my broader comment as well.
James, thanks. So I really believe in investment in infrastructure. The best way to encourage economic growth is to have good airports, seaports, highways, rail networks, all the things necessary to move stuff around. And then, of course, you have to protect that, both from cyber attack as well as from Russia's Black Sea Fleet interfering with freedom of navigation. So any investment in infrastructure that contributes to regional prosperity, I'm going to be for it. And I'm very proud that the United States has indicated it's going to contribute $1 billion through the DFC the Development Finance Corporation towards the 3 Seas initiative. Of course, that doesn't necessarily help Georgia directly, but it is an indicator that the United States is investing in the region. The port of Alexandroupoli in Greece, you've seen Ambassador Jeff Pyatt leading a lot of work down there to improve that seaport using U.S. investment there. And now ships can actually unload at Alexandroupoli, put cargo on a train and get it up to Burgas in Bulgaria, bypassing the Turkish Straits. It's cheaper and faster. So this is a competition, I think, that will benefit everybody. Now, to the specifics of the question about the Istanbul Canal. Obviously, this is a sovereign decision for Turkey to do this, and they will have to resolve the very significant environmental issues surrounding this. And of course, the cost will be massive. I think that I don't see real implications for Montreux Convention if this canal is completed, because it only affects the upper part. You still have to go through Sea of Marmara and then down through the Dardanelles. So I don't know that changes Montreux. And frankly, from an American standpoint, I don't think we want to change Montreux. In the great scheme of things, I think it's to the advantage of NATO that a NATO country, Turkey, can actually limit what comes in and goes out. But this does remind me again of the importance of this Anaklia port. I know some people think I've got target lock on this thing, but if you You know, if you can think about why the Kremlin is so against it, because, and also there's internal issues. People in Batumi and Poti are not anxious to see big competition there. But if you have a deep water port in Anaklia, then the biggest ships that can come into Black Sea can then come to Georgia. And you start talking about rail cars coming from China all the way to Europe, and you can shave 8, 10, 12 days off the amount of time it takes to move a rail car from Shanghai to Duisburg without going through Russia and without going through Iran. I have a hard time finding the downside to that, which of course is exactly why the Kremlin's against it. Last point I'd make is I thought Ambassador Pavlonis was excellent in his description of what Georgia needs to be doing, putting its voice together with other nations to elevate the significance of the Black Sea region, why it matters for the United States, why it matters for Germany, why it matters for the West, that the Black Sea be a higher priority. And if you do that, then you get more Navy presence there, you get more collaboration. And frankly, I'm tired of us always reacting to what the Kremlin does. We need to get the initiative there instead of always reacting to the Kremlin.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I mean, are there any thoughts from Zygomantas on that point about where is it that Georgia can show leadership, and where might it add the most value to NATO? That, you know, what benefits it brings as a potential NATO ally in future?
Well, honestly, the sound was so poor that I was not able to hear the response from Ben and even the question. So if you could try maybe again, but I didn't get it.
Yeah, let me try again. So the question was, where can Georgia show leadership? What are the areas that it has particular strengths, and what can it bring to NATO as a potential ally?
Okay, maybe if I understood it well, what could be the strengths of Georgia in trying to lobby its case?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my God. Okay, sound is very bad. I'm so sorry, but well, I would say if I've got it right, yeah. Well, starting from Baltic experience, the democracy record is, I think, most important to lobby the case. We had few problems in Georgia in this regard. Well, I'm happy that some compromises were found with electoral law and so on. But I really hope that for incoming elections, Georgia will show its best record ever. Yeah, well, that would, that would help us to lobby the Georgian case in the West. Where we had some issues here. Well, the pendulum of power should change. This looks suspicious when the power is staying in one hands for consecutive parliamentary elections. You cannot sell it in the West. So Georgia has to first of all, learn consensus of left and right of all political spectrum on most strategic goals, including NATO membership. In Lithuania, that was our key kind of key step of wisdom to success. All traditional parties each year renewed agreement that we have to stand together for NATO and democracy. It was never questioned. The problem with Georgia, sometimes with Ukraine and some other countries, that those political leaders who get in power, they usually imprison their opposition speakers, and this is something not to do in the future. We learn from our mistakes, but please embrace each other first win NATO membership and then, quarrel if you want inside NATO, but please respect each other. This is something to be learned from Baltic experience, I would say. That, well, on economic fronts, Georgia is doing quite great, but still they could do much better in case they promote its success, as they've been doing for some time. On military fronts, they already lead us in a lot of respects. But I would say mostly I would return to this democratic criteria. Be champion on democracy. Show it. Not only in different kind of figures, but how do you treat opposition? How do you treat people who think differently? Create broad coalitions. Show that you behave differently from very frequent examples of Eastern behavior. Be different. Be champion. Be number one on democracy. I think that is now most important, looking especially for general elections in a few weeks.
Fantastic, thank you. And just to reassure you, we can, well, at least certainly I can hear you very well, so the sound seems to be coming through at the very least. Emmanuel, Ian, any further thoughts on this first question? If not, I'll move on to some of the other questions in the Q&A. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it now to the next question, which I'm going to guess is directed at you, Dr. Dreyfus. So how do you see the French contribution to the NATO enhanced capabilities in the eastern flank, and particularly with regard to Georgia? So where you see that kind of future French contribution and bilateral partnerships in the region?
The question is, how do I see the French contribution to NATO-Georgia relation, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. Broadening in future.
Yeah, so it has been thriving for the past few years. So I'm not like within the decision-making process. But, I guess that it will keep going this way for the years to come. The most important to bear in mind, I think, is that to my understanding, the French approach is currently based on focusing really on the practical dimension of NATO-Georgia cooperation. And that's why taking the lead of its air defense component of the SNGP was a very important move for France. Rather, of course, the political support, the French political support to Georgia remains intact, but it seems that now both what really counts right now is to enhance Georgia defense capability, is to support Georgian defense reform, and that's why the French approach is based on the practical side of this cooperation. And just if I can add, like, I can provide a broader picture of French involvement in the NATO eastern flank. It's not only with Georgia, but it also with the role played by France in the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states, of course. And more broadly speaking, so not only about NATO, but about French involvement in the region. It's of course about French political contribution to the process in Ukraine and in the Nagorno-Karabakh region. So the approach is both political and practical. And when it comes to Georgia, France has decided to focus on the practical dimension of this contribution.
Fantastic. Ian, you talked a lot about obviously the challenges around resilience, which is just one example of an area where there are those kind of practical challenges that around capability development and modernization that Emmanuel was just talking about. I mean, what are the things that a small nation such as Georgia can do with finite resources to increase its own resilience, but also in doing so to obviously make itself more attractive and more credible as a future NATO ally?
Yes, well, I think we could point to some things that Georgia has already done. I mean, it was a significant beneficiary of external assistance to combat threats to nuclear security, for example. But through that external assistance, it's built a quite effective national response plan, which could be the platform for a broader discussion with neighboring countries in the Black Sea region about how to develop an effective regional response. I would say probably best if that's approached with a certain degree of humility, that Georgia has very interesting things to bring to the table, but it's not seeking to be an instructor of its neighbors, but to facilitate a constructive dialogue. So I think building those kind of regional cooperation arrangements around things that Georgia has already achieved would be one way forward. The second point would be that Georgia is the focal point for the European Union's regional response to CBRN risk. The Secretariat is based in Tbilisi. There are important facilities like the biological laboratory, which has been built with external assistance. So I think Georgia has important things to bring to the table. I would just say, I mean, it is a rather technical discussion. And the question of how to leverage those technical issues to bring about political change is probably an interesting one to think about. I'm not sure if these very technical approaches can really produce the kind of political payoff that some of the other panelists are referring to, but they're very useful and necessary steps. So I would say the more that can be done to encourage the leverage of existing responsibilities, of existing capabilities rather, the better.
I see from the Q&A that we've got my RAN colleague, Steve Flanagan, would like to answer. I'd like to ask and answer a question live. So I'm just going to quickly bring Steve in, if you'd like to turn your camera on, Steve.
All right, can you hear me? I actually had a question for General Hodges. I was intrigued by your suggestion that perhaps looking at unifying the various exercises that take place in the region, Noble Partners, Sea Breeze, and I wondered, do you think that's a function that NATO should play, or is that something the United States could work together across services to try to bring together in a more coherent way the overall efforts to enhance regional stability and ability to response to emerging crises? Thanks.
Steve, thanks very much. I think probably the United States should go ahead and lead on this, since the Noble Partner exercise is a Georgian American multinational exercise that usually includes the UK and one or two other countries. And then of course, Sea Breeze is a Ukrainian hosted naval exercise. But I think that, what'll happen is kind of like with the Defender 20 exercise, the large redeployment of forces from the United States to Europe that was unfortunately curtailed this summer by COVID. NATO has now adopted it, and next year we'll have Steadfast Defender 21. So the alliance is putting its logo basically and adding its own objectives and expanding the exercise, which is exactly what I think should be happening. So if the U.S. could encourage a collaboration of these things, and it's not so much that I'm trying to have a big giant exercise that would alarm people, but if there ever is a conflict in Georgia, for example, or in the region where the United States would need or want to be able to come to the assistance of our partners, you have to practice, as you well know, you have to practice the movement. I mean, you have to get there. You've got different rail gauge in Georgia than you have in Western Europe. So if you put we put equipment on a ferry in Burgas, excuse me, in Bulgaria. The equipment goes on train, rolls right onto the ferry, and it's a different rail gauge on the ferry than the one that it got there. So you have to practice these things. And also I'd be looking for alternative routes, you know, to be able to convoy through Turkey, for example, to get to Georgia. I mean, we're working through all the many challenges of this, airspace management, integrated air and missile defense. That would be the beauty of something like this. And also, frankly, this is part of taking the initiative in the Black Sea. Instead of wringing our hands about, oh, Montreux won't let us do stuff, we figure out how do you get the most out of the potential capacity that actually is there.
Great, thank you.
I mean, of course, General Hodges, you've brought us there kind of closer to thinking about some of the practicalities of how NATO would, you know, deploy forces forward, not necessarily, you know, because of a conflict, but at least just to maintain a forward posture and obviously a credible deterrence in and around Georgia. There's a couple of questions we've had in the Q&A around the idea of an amended Article 5. As we all know, Russia has obviously viewed its occupation of a large chunk of Georgia as a kind of de facto way of vetoing membership, or a potential way of convincing, you know, more reluctant members within NATO that if Georgia were to enter into the alliance, that could quite quickly kind of trigger a conflict if, you know, Article 5 were to be invoked, which is clearly something that some within NATO are rather concerned about. There's this idea of amending Article 5 to try and kind of get around that in terms of looking at, you know, what geographic areas things apply to and what sort of requirements might be placed on kind of Georgian security and territorial integrity before we get to a kind of Article 5. Just drawing on those two questions. So, you know, one in the Q&A asks, do we believe in the applicability of an amended Article 5? Any of the panelists? And then the other one says that the idea of an amended Article 5 for Georgia is intriguing, and it begs for practical mechanisms for increased security before it's in place. You know, do we think this is credible? I'll turn over now to the panelists to hear your thoughts. Perhaps if we go back to Lieutenant General Hodges first.
So first of all, I don't think you need to. No, let me say it a different way. We got to make sure we're doing everything we can. That's the collective we, and Georgia especially, to be as indigestible as possible, to make it look so painful that the Russians would not even be willing to consider doing again what they did in 2008, that it would be so costly in every single category. And we should, that's why the idea of a large exercise, and also making it clear to the Kremlin that if they were to go into Georgia again, we won't necessarily retaliate near Georgia. We're going to retaliate somewhere else and inflict with what we would call a horizontal escalation and inflict a lot of pain there. Now, I think that the statement by Foreign Minister Lavrov back in September of 2019 was incredibly an appalling statement when he says, well, you know, if NATO invites Georgia to join, but including only the territories that are administered by Tbilisi. In other words, yes, don't bring Abkhazia and South Ossetia, we won't go to war. I mean, what an outrageous statement by supposedly one of the deans of the diplomatic community of Europe to say something like that. I think that the alliance should invite Georgia to join today, do what we said we were going to do. And then if people are concerned about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, remember, we welcomed Germany, West Germany, into the alliance in 1962, when 1/3 of Germany was still occupied by 1 million Soviet troops. And at the time, people thought, oh my God, you know, Germany's gonna be divided forever. It actually has been reunified now longer than it was divided. So put a little historical context on this. We just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the reunification this past weekend in Germany. So I would say never, ever, ever, ever acknowledge or agree to annexation or partition, but don't be deterred by the fact that you've got Russia occupying those two regions of Georgia.
Ian, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting discussion. I mean, I'm sure that within the framework of the alliance, that proceed with caution would probably be the watchword, since the alliance has been so successful over time. And so any suggestion of moving away from things like a consensus principle would be looked at for a long time before people were willing to go down that track. But nevertheless, I think the issues are on the table now, and in two senses. One is the concern that whatever capabilities you create may never be used because of the difficulty of reaching political agreement on what to do and when to do it. And so you have ideas around like so-called constructive abstention, where a country might say, look, we're not sure that this is the right thing to be doing, but we're not going to block a decision to use NATO assets in this contingency. You could almost say that's a little bit of what happened with Libya. I mean, there were countries like Germany that were deeply skeptical but didn't prevent the operations. And the second issue of whether you have topics and issues with this constantly shifting idea of what national security is, that countries will argue fall outside the parameters of Article 5 and don't meet various criteria. So bottom line, I think this discussion about who's going to react to what and when, it's increasingly coming to the surface. And if you continuously say, well, we don't believe that this meets the criteria for collective action, more states are going to say, well, what's the purpose of this alliance if our national security interests somehow are outside the framework of what's permissible?
Absolutely. I mean, I think jumping in on that point, it clearly raises issues that aren't specific to Georgia, but certainly affect Georgia around, some of the kind of sub-threshold threats that, have already been mentioned, around cyber, electronic and information operations, around disinformation, around economic coercion, and how these are interpreted differently by different nations within NATO, and what we, collectively see as a legitimate and proportionate response to potential forms of attack or subversion. These are kind of live debates. I mean, NATO is, only 4 years ago recognized cyber as a domain, for example. It's only just published its first doctrine on how cyber operations should work. And clearly there are, deep divisions between different national perspectives on things like offensive cyber capabilities. So against that backdrop, the NATO is itself kind of in a state of flux when it comes to understanding where some of those thresholds might be, or at the very least how they might be communicated politically, and then obviously communicated through, posture and forces and exercises and all of the other things that go into maintaining a deterrence. Just want to see if Emmanuel or Zigomantas, if you wanted to jump in on that question around Article 5. I will take silence as a no. So we have another question in the Q&A, kind of turning to more regional security dynamics, which is what we see as Georgia's responsibility towards Armenia and Azerbaijan, given the ongoing conflict and tensions there. And I think I would add to that, building on some of the comments earlier from Zigomantas about the lack of a strategic vision from NATO. What could NATO also be doing in the region to enhance regional security? So I think I'll turn over to Ben first, if that's okay.
Well, again, sound is very poor for some reason, but I will try to reply from the pieces I got from the previous question. As I understood, you've been asking what about those occupied territories and if NATO membership for Georgia can even more provoke Russia. So Lithuanian experience is very different. Actually, one of the biggest mistakes of the West that they do think that Russians behave in a way you behave. In Russia, words and deeds, this is something completely different. If they say that something will provoke you, actually do exactly the opposite. You know, they were saying to us that, oh, EU and NATO membership for Baltics will actually provoke Russia. Honestly, if we would follow this Russian advice today, we would be simply occupied. You know, we would be in a similar situation like Ukraine or Georgia or even Belarus. We never listened to Russian fairy tales. The same was said about Kaliningrad enclave. Well, if Lithuania joins, it will provoke, you know, the Third World War. Don't listen to that, because Russians see, if you listen to their arguments, they will exactly understand that you are weak and they can proceed. That was exactly what happened in Bucharest. You got that kind of propaganda from Russia, and it froze the action from the West. Yeah, you have to do differently. You have to firmly, okay, we as a West, we have to firmly state about Georgia's membership. And be it Cyprus, be it German history, you know, all the problems that Russians created on those territories, well, they will be solved with the time. But if you will, if we will demonstrate our weakness to Russia, they will go until the limit. You know, they simply conquer those territories. We set the red lines for Russians. If Russians don't feel it, they go. This is not kind of, you know, or the leadership, I don't say about the nation, the leadership doesn't abide to international rules or rules that we set. They go until the limit we set to them. So I think the only way to save Georgia, to save Caucasus, to save Ukraine, to save even Belarus, to be very clear about our strategic vision. Those are European countries. They belong to the West. Russia, this is not your territories. Get out, please. Yeah, you know, tear down those walls, as Reagan was saying. That actually makes the best impression on Kremlin leadership, and they leave those territories. But if you do say nothing, if you mumble for 12 years, if you make promises and say actually nothing, they will proceed, because they understand that you are weak. You have no resolve, you have no vision, and they will always find that vision. And finally, what I wanted to say, listening to your previous debates, well, on Georgia, you know, I understand that you look perfect, well, to compare with other nations, but as some of you mentioned, you still have to apply a regional approach. To sell just Georgia in the West, in Europe's East, it's too difficult. You have to sell the whole concept, the whole region, be it Black Sea, be it Ukraine and Georgia, but moving groups. Later, you know, the West will make a selection and real champions will be awarded. But even, for example, Georgian silence on events in Belarus, it sounds very strange in Lithuania. You know, Lithuanians are fighting and dying for democracy in the East. So why Georgia is silent about what is happening in Belarus? You know, why don't you support it? Because that's the same case. Kremlin is killing freedom all around in all neighboring countries. So if today you are asking me to lobby for your NATO membership, why are you so silent when Belarusians revolt for their freedom? Why do you more or less recognize Lukashenko regime? This is stupid. This is not the case. And you know, then when you next time will ask my support on you, I will remind you about that. You know, stay in solidarity with all the nations in the Europe's East, because the enemy is the one. This is Kremlin that is attacking us all. So stay with Belarusians, stay with Ukrainians, stay even with Moldovans. They are in more difficult situation. You know, look around, look to Caucasus. I understand that this is so difficult and divided, but do something. Glue the, you know, 3 countries in the Caucasus. It sounds very difficult, but do it. You know, the more difficult, the better. You know, we were also different in the Baltics, but we managed to stay together. Now we are with Nordic countries. Regional approach will save you. If you think that you can survive alone, not true.
Thanks for that. And we've just heard there, about the need for Georgia to be a kind of a glue in regional security. Ben, just some kind of final comments there before we wrap up the Q&A.
So thanks, James. And I associate myself with everything that Zigis just said. To the question about what responsibility does Georgia have with regards to the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh? For sure, only the Kremlin benefits from this fighting. Nobody else benefits. Only the Kremlin benefits, and that's their approach, is to keep instability around its periphery through proxies. And I think that they're going to allow the fighting to go a little bit longer, but then they're going to stop it as long as their interests are still being protected. But the reason this matters for Georgia is the transit route between Eurasia and Europe has to go through Azerbaijan and Georgia. And so you need a stable, secure environment. The so-called Ganya Gap has got to be protected from Armenian rocket fire, all the things that are being done here. So I think Georgia should be drawing attention to the fact that disruption of oil and gas moving east and west or other trade through this portal, it's going to have a negative downstream effect on Europe. And so once again, this goes back to highlighting the strategic importance of the Caucasus, and Georgia needs to be a loud voice about this.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. As I just do some kind of quick closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up this first session, conscious of the need to get on to lots of more interesting debates in the course this afternoon. We've discussed a lot collectively about some of the challenges, but also the opportunities that Georgia faces at the moment. I think there's kind of violent agreement around that Georgia brings a lot to NATO, potentially in terms of its capabilities, in terms of its evident ability to commit and contribute to NATO operations, even though it's not been a NATO member up until now. Its ability to understand and offer a kind of unique perspective on Russia as a neighbor, as a threat, as a large nation that we all have to live with and engage with, and of course successfully deter where necessary. But also its broader understanding of an increasingly vital region within Europe, both kind of politically but also economically, as has been discussed. So clearly, there was a lot of enthusiasm there from many quarters for seeing an increased role for Georgia with and eventually within NATO, but also some real challenges that remain in terms of kind of the politics of how we push that through, how we untangle some of the kind of political opposition and practical barriers to membership, and also how we bring not just Georgia into the kind of NATO way of thinking, but also the broader region, and as has been mentioned just now, including also a kind of sustainable security and kind of broader reforms for Armenia and Azerbaijan. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their contributions. I'd like to thank them for putting up with Zoom technology. And also thank you to everyone who has been listening and also who's contributed questions in the Q&A function. It's much appreciated. With that, I'll turn it back over to our hosts who will hopefully set up the plan for the second panel, which I understand will be beginning shortly.